Hey there people, how you doing? So today we have another very interesting comparison on our hands here. It's the Xiaomi Mi 10 versus the Vivo X50 Pro. Now, although both of them cost the same amount of money, they are built in very different ways, on a fundamental level even. For instance, the Xiaomi Mi 10 has a flagship Snapdragon 865 processor. It's got the humongous 108 megapixel sensor, and well, it's got no telephoto zoom lens whatsoever, so no aspect of zooming at all. But for the Vivo, it's got a mid-range Snapdragon 765G processor, and for the cameras, it's got a much more standardized 48 megapixel Sony sensor, but it's got a very unique gimbal stabilization system, and really, it's something else, both in terms of convenience and overall quality that you can get in terms of just stabilization alone. It's really a godsend in my opinion at least. As for zoom on the X50 Pro, well, it's got a lot of versatilities to say the least, because there's a 2x optical zoom 13 megapixel camera and a 5x periscope zoom camera as well, so there's like a lot of things you can do in terms of zoom. So now, it's obviously time to see which one of these two camera systems will be better in terms of images for this one. The video comparison is going to come out very soon. Jumping right in for the first image. There are two schools of thought. First and foremost is, the X50 Pro is a lot brighter, which gives it better shadow detail. Quite a bit better actually. But when you look at the sky, there, the highlights are a lot better maintained on the Mi 10, so really it's anyone's choice. Now I prefer the X50 Pro here, it's my personal preference really, but then again, it's quite possible that you might prefer the Mi 10, so I'm willing to call this first one a tie. For this one, however, I do think that the Mi 10 is doing a slightly better job in terms of the dynamic range overall, so I'm gonna pick the Mi 10 for this one. You know, the X50 Pro really doesn't have that great a start, but things might change, and this is basically what I was talking about. You can see the X50 Pro has much better colors in terms of the leaves overall. And as I've said before, the X50 Pro has basically the best rendition of greens and the most natural and accurate color representations that I've seen so far. The Mi 10 on the other hand, it's given a way colder image. I did try to turn off the AI camera feature on the Mi 10, but it only seems to worsen the image even more, making it a little bit more colder, so not a great image from the Mi 10 really. Now for this ultra wide angle image, I have to say, the X50 Pro is doing a far better job than the Mi 10 in terms of the shadow detail. But when you look at the sky, I do like how the clouds look overall on the Mi 10. But of course, I'm gonna pick the X50 Pro because man, those shadows, they look crispy. But the moment we jump into the main cameras, well, the things change drastically. Because you can see, the Mi 10 has amazing shadows and the colors look fantastic. The X50 Pro is actually faltering a little against the Mi 10 because that dynamic range is something else. And you know, it's not just the dynamic range, but actually the colors on the Mi 10 that are really making that image stand out so much. So for that reason, I'm gonna pick the Xiaomi Mi 10 for this one. Now this is a 2x zoom shot, and once again, the Mi 10 has just fantastic colors, and the dynamic range is also a tad bit better in my opinion. So I'm gonna pick the Mi 10 for this one as well. And detail wise, I'd say both of them look very similar because even though the Mi 10 has no optical zoom, it's got a 108 megapixel sensor to crop into. Now moving on to 5x zoom, and here you can see the clear difference between the Mi 10 and the X50 Pro. The Vivo, since it has a 5x periscope zoom lens, it produces a lot more natural detail than the Xiaomi Mi 10 could with that sharpening and all that. It's got a lot more artifacts than the Vivo X50 Pro. For that very reason, I'm gonna pick the X50 Pro for this image. When we move on to 10x zoom on both, well, here I'd say that neither of them look particularly fantastic, but comparatively, the X50 Pro looks far better. You can see the Xiaomi Mi 10 with all that grain artifacting and the sharpening artifacts, it's a mess really. The X50 Pro, although not the sharpest image I've seen, it's still not as bad as a Mi 10. Now for this image, it's the main camera, and I have to say, the Xiaomi Mi 10 is actually doing a slightly better job with the sky particularly. And you know, for all the images that I've taken so far, it would appear that the Xiaomi Mi 10 really just prioritizes the sky above all. Because you can see even in this image, it's maintaining the details of the clouds and the exposure very well. this is a trend that the Mi 10 has. It'll make sure that the sky is perfectly exposed and the details of the clouds will be well kept in check. It's something that the Mi 10 does just a tad bit better than the X50 Pro. Now moving on to the ultra wide angle image, and here the exact thing that I just said happened. The sky does look a lot more detailed and the clouds look a lot more prominent on the Mi 10, exactly how they looked in real life. While the Vivo X50 Pro, although it has a little bit better shadow detail overall, the sky doesn't look that appealing. But even so, I'm going to pick the X50 Pro because shadows and their details matter a little bit more to me. But if you're someone who just cares about sky more than anything else, the Xiaomi Mi 10 does a really good job. Okay, now let's move indoors. And this is a very well lit condition and Valentine looks fantastic as usual. But overall, I'd say that the details might be a little bit more on the X50 Pro. It could also be just extra sharpening, but nonetheless, I'm actually going to call this one a tie because everything looks so very similar on both. But the moment the conditions worsen, and here for example, it's a complete backlit situation. You can see the X50 Pro is just in a league of its own in terms of HDR, and the shadow detail is just phenomenal to say the least. Now these are the higher resolution images that we can get from both the phones, 48 megapixels on the X50 Pro and 108 megapixels on the Mi 10. Now understandably, you might expect that it's gonna be a ton more detailed on the Mi 10 because of nearly more than double the resolution, but really it's not the case. The only real difference that I can see, even on zooming in, is that extra bit of bokeh that you can get on the background. It looks pretty fantastic on the Mi 10, but other than that, there really isn't any real noticeable legible difference. For that very reason, I'm calling this one a tie. Moving on to selfies, and admittedly this is a very harsh condition. You can see that there is quite a bright light right on top of me, but yeah, the X50 Pro really manages to expose my face very well. The Mi 10 on the other hand, it feels a little too dark and the colors look a little weird. So I'm gonna pick the X50 Pro. For this portrait selfie, again, harsh conditions are really my thing, I guess, because you can see there is a pretty bright lamp right behind me, and yeah, both of them are overexposing that, but the Vivo X50 Pro is just in another level in terms of overexposing the background. But it's actually making me as a subject look quite a bit better. I have a lot more brightness on my face. The overall details look a little bit better even. So I'm going to pick the X50 Pro, even though the background doesn't look as nice as on the Mi 10. Now turning down those insane conditions a notch, well, here I'd say both of them look very similar in terms of edge detection. Both are very good actually. But since I'm the subject, I actually look a little bit better on the X50 Pro. Having a lot more brightness and a lot more detail on my face really makes me as a subject stand out a lot more. So for that reason, I'm picking the X50 Pro once again. Now, low light selfie. That is something that the X50 Pro does amazingly well because it's got night mode on the selfie camera. I have to say, the X50 Pro does a fantastic job in terms of maintaining detail on my face. The brightness is just amazing. And finally, it's also got a lot less grain in the background. Now you might be thinking why that little area on the wall is lit. Well, there wasn't an actual light. It would appear that the night mode somehow managed to think of that place as it should be bright and not dark, so it brightened that up. But I can assure you, the conditions were exactly the same. There wasn't any extra light. For rear portraits, well, I think I don't even have to say anything here because the X50 Pro is by far the better one here. Not only do I as a subject look better and a lot more brighter, but you can see in the background, the dynamic range on that lamp is just fantastic. And now this one, I just wanted to point it out that the X50 Pro can do a 2x zoom shot on portraits, which is actually quite desirable. But the Mi 10 unfortunately doesn't even have the option to crop in. And that could be a bummer for some people because zooming in 2x could give a lot better framing in terms of the portrait. Now for night mode, and I just want to say these conditions aren't exactly hard. We'll get to the extreme night mode situations very soon, but for now, here you can see very similar on both. I'm going to call this a tie because really there's almost no difference at all. Now this is an ultra wide angle shot, and here I'd say that the only real difference that I found upon very close inspection is you can see that lower part of that black area it has a lot more white streaks on the X50 Pro than on the Mi 10. It would appear that the Mi 10 somehow managed to gobble those white streaks up. And so for that reason alone, just a processing error I want to call it, I'm going to pick the X50 Pro for this image. Moving on to the main camera, and here, I don't think once again there are a lot of differences. Of course, the conditions are not super harsh either, but yeah, I'd say that the only thing that really stands out is that extra bit of vibrance on the Mi 10. It's not as realistic as some might want it, but you know, for a painting, you'd want the painting to look exactly like it looks in real life. And I'd say the X50 Pro comes a lot closer to that than the Mi 10. And well, since I'm the artist, I want to pick the X50 Pro because it looks a lot more like the painting that I painted. Now this one, again, very similar on both, at least in terms of the subject. But if you take a look at that little bit of the wall right beside the painting, you can see that the X50 Pro is overexposing it, while the Mi 10 is doing a far better job in terms of maintaining the highlight. So for that reason, I'm picking the Mi 10 for this image. Now, I did turn off a few more lights, but again, upon just first impressions, you'd think that these two look almost exactly the same, maybe just a little bit of color shifting and all. But let me point out to you that there is a lot more contrast on the Mi 10 than on the X50 Pro, which is actually making a little bit of the details right at the bottom of the canvas just vanish. It's not a drastic difference, but it's a difference nonetheless. And another thing that annoyed me a little bit more than just the extra bit of contrast is that the Mi 10 looks a lot more colder in terms of color temperature, so for that reason it looks a lot more natural, especially in those trees in the background. And since the X50 Pro manages to pull off the most accurate image that I've seen so far of this painting, I'm gonna pick the X50 Pro for this one. Now, we are moving into extreme night situations. And I've gotta say, it was so dim I could barely even see that statue thing, and even so, the X50 Pro does a far better job. Obviously. You can see brightness on the subject, the background, everything looks so much better. And even the details, I believe, after zooming in a lot, is just like a tad bit better. The image changes, but the story basically remains the same. The X50 Pro has far better brightness and the background is completely crushed on the Mi 10, while the X50 Pro performs so much better. Now I did switch on another light, and here, surprisingly, the Mi 10 is actually doing a better job in terms of exposing the subject. You can see that the overall colors, the details even look a little bit better on the Mi 10, and so obviously I'm picking the Mi 10 for this image. But of course, we really cannot forget the teal and orange look that we can get on the X50 Pro in night mode. These are, as I said before, the presets that you can set for any image that you take with night mode, and man, in this situation it looks super cool. It doesn't exactly make the image look any better, but it just gives it this very different stylized look that, well, I kinda like it. The fact that the wall changes to look like a turquoise or a teal finish, and the statue or sarcophagus or pharaoh, whatever it is, it looks very rich bronze rather than gold. Well, you know, you can change up things quite nicely if you use this in the right situations. But of course, finally, we have a macro image. And here, well, the Mi 10, although it has a dedicated macro camera, it's just 2 megapixels, and really 2 megapixels aren't a lot of pixels. As you can see here, it's all smudged up, there's a lot of artifacting, sharpness is like barely even there. The X50 Pro, on the other hand, that uses the ultra-wide angle camera for its macro images, and we all gotta admit, it looks pretty much fantastic right there. So that wraps up this camera comparison, and I have to admit, the Xiaomi Mi 10 came very close. But yeah, I'm going to pick the X50 Pro because, you know, the night mode is a tad bit better. And when you think about zoom, it's got a lot more versatility. And of course, it's got that amazing representation of colors overall that I've seen so far. The macro camera is quite a bit better that I just showed you recently. And overall, I do think that the X50 Pro gives us a lot more fully featured package as a camera system. Not to mention that gimbal camera, which is, again, fantastic. It really helps with the night mode images. And you can take a lot longer exposures, like 5-6 seconds even, without breaking a sweat. Well, on the Mi 10, for example, we can take maybe 2-3 seconds. It doesn't even go for anything higher. So definitely, that gimbal camera is not just helping in video, it also helps a lot in the night mode images that we take. Now, of course, I'm praising the Vivo a lot, but it's got its problems. The inconsistency in particular. Because you saw in all these images, there was a lot of back and forth going on, especially on this comparison. And for all the three comparisons that I've done, you can check them out. And yeah, definitely, the X50 Pro does exhibit a lot more inconsistency in terms of image processing. When it gets it right, it does an amazing job. But when it doesn't get it right and the processing doesn't happen in the proper fashion, well, it could give you quite an undesirable result, and you could be out there scratching your head thinking why the dynamic range isn't good, or maybe the detail levels are bad. It could be anything really. But of course, for this comparison, I definitely think the X50 Pro did a better job overall. And if Vivo is listening, which I doubt it, but if they are, I really hope that they can manage and really improve that consistency of image processing, because they have an amazing thing going for them, and improving it and making it a lot more stable will just, make this camera so much more better. But that wraps up this comparison, and I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, do hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you guys later. Cheers.